So today really will be shorter. So there should be plenty of time for Q&A on any of the previous talks too. I'll be talking about Minsky and functional finance. You've seen this slide before. I just wanted to point out how many times Minsky's name is mentioned. So I can trace most of the components of modern money theory back to Minsky. And you've seen a version of this. Minsky's claim anyone can create money, the problem is to get it accepted. And what he means is that each state has its own money of account, and anyone can write IOUs denominated in that money. So that's what he means by creating money, if you get it accepted. Banks are firms. Like any other firm, they try to earn profits. And like any other firm, they innovate to get around constraints and try to earn more profits. Central banks supervise, they regulate, and they set the interest rate target. Okay, so all of that is stuff we've covered before. When we come out of World War II, there is something of a general consensus around what became Keynesian economics in the post-war period. Economies naturally suffer from demand gaps. There aren't any market forces that move you quickly enough to full employment. So there's a role in using fiscal policy to try to close the demand gaps. So you use the budget position as a policy tool to close demand gaps. There also was a consensus among many people that there's nothing wrong with budget deficits. Beardsley Rummel, I think I mentioned before, wrote an article, Taxes or Revenue for Obsolete. Taxes for revenue are obsolete. You use them for other purposes, but you don't need them for revenue purposes. That doesn't mean you can get rid of taxes. So some people interpret modern money theory as saying you don't need taxes. You do need taxes. You just don't need them for revenue. Okay? In the old days, it was more obvious because you burned your revenue. So obviously you don't need it for revenue purposes because you just get back something you're going to burn. Abba Lerner formulated the principles of functional finance. Government should spend more if there's unemployment. So that's the fiscal policy recommendation. Government should supply more money, and by that he meant high-powered money, reserves, if interest rates are too high. So this is not quite the way we would state it. It's not quite accurate. As I talked about before, you don't actually have to provide more reserves in order to lower the interest rate. You just announce a lower interest rate target. But back in the days when you didn't know what the target was, this could be used as a signal. So he argued very strongly the budgetary outcome, the debt outcome should never be a primary consideration. So balancing your budget or achieving a surplus or minimizing the size of your deficit is never a primary consideration. The primary consideration is full employment without high inflation. He also developed a steering wheel metaphor. Government can use its policy instruments, fiscal policy, monetary policy, to keep the economy on course. So he likened it to using your steering wheel, and he had an example of Martians coming down and noticing that there were guardrails and the cars would just bounce from side to side because people hadn't figured out you used the steering wheel. So he said that's the way they've been running their economy now. Now let's get a hold of the steering wheel and drive right down the center of the road. Okay. Modern money theory has taken from Lerner had another very important paper, Money is a Creature of the State, which was essentially a revival of the Knapp's state money approach. So from Minsky and Lerner, the modern money theorists have taken the idea that taxes drive money, that is in the Money as a Creature of the State paper by Lerner, and it's also in a couple of statements by Minsky. It's in the Stabilizing book. It's as a footnote, but it's in the book. And Stephanie Kelton has distinguished between three positions. Deficit hawk, okay, those are the people who think that you need to balance your budget all the time. Deficit dove, which argues it's okay to have a deficit in recessions, but you should have a surplus when the economy is growing too fast. So on average, you balance the budget. That's the position that most of the Keynesian types were taking. Minsky and Lerner were taking a stronger position than that, more of a deficit owl position. There's not even necessarily a reason to balance your budget over the course of the cycle. So the deficit owl position is similar to the statement that the debt outcome should never be a primary consideration of policy. This just repeats the functional finance. Now, Minsky hardly ever used the term functional finance. When I was a student, I never heard him say it. Going through all of his writing, I've really only found one place where it shows up in his writing. It's in a paper in 1960 written with Irma Edelman, where it's very explicit. Now, why do I say it's strange? Lerner and Minsky were very close. Okay, Lerner was sort of a supervisor of Minsky. And they had similar ideas on this topic. So it's a little strange Minsky didn't mention it much. So I'll try to explain why I think that is. In this paper he did. So they start off the paper, they say much of the following is related to the principles of functional finance. Okay, so there, it's very explicit. And he cites the famous book, Economics of Control, and also another book, Economics of Employment. They also say at the very beginning of the paper, an old-fashioned assumption underlies this paper, that full employment and price stability are compatible. Well, functional finance says that they are compatible. Why is he calling that old-fashioned? Because the Phillips curve had been discovered. Okay, so now it's become old-fashioned. Now, if you adopt the Phillips curve, you believe they're not compatible. You need unemployment in order to have stable prices. So this paper rejects that and adopts the old-fashioned assumption of functional finance. National debt is unique, for there is no default risk. Okay? This is very explicit. There is no default risk on national government debt. Now, the unacknowledged assumption here is if it's denominated in your own currency. Okay? I am sure Minsky would have said that that's not true if you denominate in foreign currency. You might be forced to default. The only risks are that the interest rate and the price level might change. Okay? So if you're running budget deficits, there could be interest rate and inflation impacts. The total wealth of private units equals the value of things in the economy plus the value of the national debt. So what he's saying is that within the private sector, all the credits and debits net to zero. The only thing left is government debt and real assets. Okay, so we net out all the inside, what's called inside wealth, the private credits and debits, that nets to zero. All that is left is the real assets, and the only financial assets are claims on the government. Okay, this is a sectoral balance approach that later was developed by Godby. It's also Ritter's paper that comes out in 1963, so Minsky already has it in 1960. The best policy, now they formulate a model, they run the model, and this is the results they get out of their model. Okay, summarizing the results. The best policy is low interest rate with national debt growing at the same rate as private debt. So the best policy is a low interest rate and growing debt, okay? With national government debt and private debt growing at the same rate, and both equal to the rate of growth of productivity. The best outcome is debt is growing along with productivity. Okay. Now, I don't want to go through the model. It's not important for the arguments I'm making here. You can read the paper if you want. It's at the Minsky archives at the Levy Institute. This wasn't published. It's a draft paper, but it's available on the archives. In the 1963 American Economic Review paper that I mentioned earlier, so this one is published, you can read it, he actually modified this and argued that a government-led expansion is more sustainable. So actually you want government debt to grow faster than private debt. You want the government to be leading growth, not the private sector. Okay? So that's a stronger position in favor of government debt than the 1960 paper was. 1968, this is a very good paper. One of his, I think, best papers that he ever produced. The effects of shifts of aggregate demand. That's not quite the full title, it's most of it. I think that this one is in the 2013 book that the Levy Institute put out, a collection of his papers. Because in this paper, there's a lot of discussion of the job guarantee. In this paper, he argued that tight full employment should be about a 3% unemployment rate. He had thought this could be achieved through a general increase of aggregate demand. In other words, typical Keynesian stimulus. So in the past, he had thought that's all you need. Keynesian stimulus of aggregate demand in general, you could achieve 3%. Now he says it cannot. You cannot attain sustained full employment on this definition of a 3% measured unemployment rate through a general increase of aggregate demand. Why not? It will increase financial instability and crunches, a financial crisis. It will lead to inflation. It won't improve and might even increase inequality. Remember I talked about the results of Pavlina Chernova's work. Growth can increase inequality. Minsky argued this in '68. If growth is the result of a general stimulus of aggregate demand, it might even increase inequality. This goes against the Kennedy-Johnson CEA argument that you could use growth alone and things will trickle down. So we have to pay attention to the structure of aggregate demand. We need directed aggregate demand. So general demand pumping won't work because it has all these problems associated with it. You have to have directed aggregate demand. So we need employer of last resort to achieve and sustain tight full employment, not trickle down policy. Trickle down economics in the United States, if you say that, everyone associates that with Reaganomics. That was supply side trickle down. Supply side trickle down is tax cuts for the rich cause them to spend more and jobs trickle down to the poor. Keynesian trickle down was pump up aggregate demand and jobs trickle down to the poor. They're both trickle down. One is Keynesian, one is Reaganomics, supply side economics. But they're both trickle down. So we don't want trickle down, we want bubble up. Bubble up is hiring off the bottom. Demand bubbles up when you give jobs to the poor. Okay, so that's the correct approach. That will reduce inequality, will enhance price and financial stability. So rather than relying on general demand stimulus, which typically is to stimulate investment spending, which creates instability and inflation and might increase inequality, you want to target jobs to the unemployed, and that will reduce inequality, enhance price and financial stability, and of course create jobs where they're most needed. The implications of this analysis are that the budget stance is important for price, currency, and financial stability. We need the budget to move countercyclically. Minsky is most famous for the financial instability hypothesis, and a lot of people interpret that as meaning that Keynes, like Keynes, Minsky was all about depression economics. That's not true. Minsky was more worried about the boom than the bust. He's more worried about explosive growth upward than about falling into a depression. Now, why is that? Because we have a big bank and a big government. We have a central bank that will intervene, we have a government that will intervene to prevent us from falling into a depression. So he's no longer worried about depressions in the early post-war period. He's worried about bubbles, explosive growth upward that causes inflation and creates conditions in which you have severe financial crises. So that's what he's more worried about. So you need a counter-cyclical swing of the budget. You need it to move toward a surplus in a boom. That will suck demand, suck income out of the economy if the budget moves toward a surplus. In the early post-war period, we needed government debt as a safe asset. It was leverage for growth. So we come out of the Great Depression, we come out of World War II with a federal government debt to GDP ratio of 100%. Okay, that was very high at that time. We have some countries around the world that are at 100, 200, 250% of GDP debt ratios. But at the time, this was a very high ratio. Minsky always argued that, in a sense, that government debt was leverage for growth. It gave firms and households and banks a very safe asset that they could leverage for economic growth. With that safe asset in their portfolio, they were willing to spend more and perhaps even to borrow because they had a safe asset in their portfolio. So we needed government debt as a safe asset, but too much government debt will encourage the central bank to rely more on open market purchases to supply reserves rather than lending at the discount window. Now, this is sort of an aside for this class. Minsky was always worried about the central bank reducing its use of the discount window and increasing open market purchases, that is buying government bonds, as a way to supply reserves to the banking system. Now, why would he care? The reason is because if banks have to go to the discount window, the central bank can say, okay, we will lend reserves to you, but we want to see your portfolio of assets. That way, the central bank would know what the banks are doing. If the central bank supplies reserves in open market operations, it's not looking at anybody's books. Okay? The reserves are just available, and any bank that wants them can sell government bonds to get them. And if they don't want the reserves, they can always lend them in the overnight market to other banks. So this was always an issue for Minsky. He had done work on this in the early 60s, actually for the Fed. He recommended using the discount window, not using open market operations. His adversary was a monetarist who was pushing for open market operation, not the discount window. Why? Because that's a much more free market approach. The central bank is not looking at individual banks and intervening into their decision making. That was Meltzer. Meltzer was Minsky's adversary in this debate. Minsky lost. The Fed increasingly moved to open market operations. Discount window lending becomes essentially emergency lending. Banks that can't borrow in the open market, in the overnight market from other banks, because the other banks don't trust them. Those are the ones that go to the discount window. So Minsky wanted to force all the banks to go to the discount window. Anyway, the Fed is losing control of the banks. Impact of the budget on the economy depends on where spending and taxing is directed. Now, this is another statement against general demand stimulus. General demand stimulus essentially says it doesn't matter what the government spends on. It will be pumping up aggregate demand. Minsky is saying that it critically depends on what they spend on. The impact of government spending depends on what the government spends on. This reflects the difference between Minsky and mainstream Keynesians. Minsky's training was in institutional economics, as I think I said before, not in Keynesian economics. Okay. He was first an institutionalist, later he became a Keynesian. Military and transfer spendings are less productive, thus more inflationary. So transfer spending is it's an unfortunate terminology, but it's common terminology, at least in English. Welfare spending, retirement spending by the government, Social Security spending, all those are called transfers, as if you're transferring from the taxpayer to the recipient. That's where the term comes from. I say it's unfortunate because that's not what you're doing. You might tax people and you might spend on welfare, but they're completely unrelated activities. Taxing is not directly related to spending. The government burns the tax revenue, it doesn't transfer it, okay? But he's just using the terminology everyone uses. Unproductive spending means the U.S. loses competitive advantage, and it can create a current account deficit. So if we're spending on, I left out one important transfer that I'll come back to. Interest payments on government debt is another transfer payment. So if we're spending more on welfare, interest payments, and the military, then our economy is becoming less competitive compared to those that are investing in productive equipment, and we will end up with a current account deficit. The large outstanding stock of government debt makes it much harder to use counter-cyclical deficits to stabilize, because you have to pay interest even in a business cycle upswing. So the bigger the outstanding stock of debt, the more interest you have to pay. And even when the economy goes into a boom, you're still going to be paying all that interest. You might be spending less on other transfers, but you'll continue to spend on interest. Okay, I think I mentioned there's only one video that we know of Minsky giving a lecture. It's 1991. If you Google Hyman Minsky at Westminster College, you can view it. And it was about 2 years ago. Bob, I can't think of his last name right now. The guy who invited him, I guess rediscovered the video or figured out how you post them on the internet. I don't know why. It showed up about 2 years ago. And it made a big splash, first because most people probably did not ever get a chance to see Minsky speak. And second, because he seems to say things in here that are inconsistent with functional finance and modern money theory. And so it was used as evidence that Minsky didn't accept functional finance. Okay? And so there, in the blogosphere, there was a huge reaction. There are two places in particular The first is at 45 minutes into the talk. He's talking about the New Deal programs that created productive capacity. So, as I mentioned before, really it was the New Deal that developed America. We were an undeveloped country before the New Deal. It was the New Deal that gave us our roads, our schools, our post office, our airports, our bridges. That stuff was all done by the New Deal. It really was the New Deal that brought the US into the 20th century. So it created productive capacity. And also a lot of the infrastructure needed for World War II was built by the New Deal. Okay, a lot of the preparation for war. Now our spending is on transfer payments, military, and interest on debt. It's not resource creating. So now the majority of government spending is not resource creating. The problem is American debt is higher than ever before. We need the government steering wheel. I never heard Minsky talk about a government steering wheel before. This is the first time I had ever heard it come out of his mouth. But clearly this is Abba Lerner. We need the steering wheel to ensure income remains high enough to service it. So it sounds like there could be a problem making the interest payments on the government debt. Okay? We need income to be growing so we'll have enough income for the government to pay interest on the debt. Until 1980, government debt was declining as a percent of GDP. Reagan comes along, and for those who don't know, Reagan gave big tax cuts to the rich. Bush Jr. did it again, and Trump has done it again. So it's sort of a typical American thing. The rich need tax cuts. And Reagan produced a deficit of 5% of GDP. So the deficit goes from very low to 5% of GDP. And he says the quality of government debt in international markets is deteriorating. What does that mean? It sounds like he's saying US government debt is becoming risky. The quality is going down. There's no question of affording it. Okay, well that sounds like a step back. We can afford it, but we lack the will to raise taxes to validate it. Oh, we're gonna have to raise taxes to make those interest payments. Sort of sounds like he's saying that. Government must validate our debt with taxes. What does that mean? Well, Minsky uses this term validate a lot in his work when he talks about, let's say, corporate debt. Corporations have to validate their debt. How do they do that? Out of their gross profit revenues. Okay? They have to have an income to validate their debt. So it sort of sounds like the government is going to have to raise taxes to make those interest payments. Then again, at 65 minutes into the talk, he comes back to the topic again. Taxes are the price you pay for civilization. Okay, well that's sort of a joke, you know, that's made all the time. You hate taxes, but if you want to be civilized, you have to have taxes. We're not now in the position we were in the 1960s. We now have competitors, the yen and the mark. Okay, so the dollar used to be the supreme currency. Now the yen and the mark. This, for younger people here, this will sound very bizarre. But you have to remember, say 18 or 19 of the biggest banks in the world were Japanese at the time that he gave this talk. Okay, and everyone was worried about the Japanese replacing America. They had already bought America, is what everyone's claiming. They're busy buying up, you know, New York City and Hawaii, worried the Japanese are going to take over. It's laughable now, right? But this was a concern at the time. And the mark, too, although the euro solved that problem. We increased the proportion of income coming from interest. Okay, so now this is not just government payment of interest. This is sort of the financialization of the economy. That's a topic he's beginning to write about in the late 80s. This move to a new kind of capitalism, money manager capitalism. So the rentier class is taking over. In large part, assets are held abroad by higher income people and also by the FIRE sector within the US. So external holdings of the debt and debt held by the FIRE sector. We're in danger of becoming Argentina. Well, that sounds really bad, right? Argentina's going through a crisis. Spending without taxing. It means printing money. It could lead to inflation. The alternative to taxation is the inflation tax. Okay, this is the idea that governments purposely cause inflation as a way of reducing the burden of making payments on their debt. So it's called the inflation tax. It's a very orthodox idea, used all the time, especially by Austrians, who believe any inflation at all is theft. It's done purposely by the government and it's to steal from you. Okay, so he's using this very right-wing argument. So anyway, the blogs say, wow, all of this is a violation of Abba Lerner. Okay? So now I teach a course on Minsky. I did it at UMKC. Now I do it at the Leaving Institute. And what he said here, actually, we would come across in his writings. And it is hard to reconcile it with a lot of the other stuff he says, including stuff that I just showed you. Okay, where he says there's no question of solvency. Okay, a sovereign government can always make all payments, right? He always had said that. This seems to be a change in his view. So how do we explain it? And so I would try to explain it to the students, and really in the end I would say, I think that it was political. Okay, that Minsky really hated Reagan. I mean, really hated it. And it was Reagan who had changed the nature of the budget with these big tax cuts and a huge increase in military spending. Okay? And so you can understand this is sort of a lingering political fight he was having with Reaganomics. But after the video came out, I decided, I have to take the time to go back through his writings and see, is this really just an evolution of his thought, not a revolution? That is, he wasn't revolting against his old ideas, it was an evolution of his ideas. Had he really abandoned functional finance? Was he really becoming a deficit hawk, or at least a deficit dove? Or is it grounded in the writings? There are two periods where he writes stuff that sounds like what I just went through. The first was in the Reagan period, 84 to 86, and that includes the time when he was writing the stabilizing book. And then later, 91 to 94, when he was at Levy and he was writing a new book. He actually started out to rewrite the stabilizing book. He had a secretary who was typing up the chapters of the stabilizing book with the view that he would edit it and update it. He abandoned that. And instead, he was reworking working papers from this period for a book manuscript. If you go to the archives, you can find a lot of these now. A lot of what he meant to be chapters are up there on the in the archives. The problem is, first, he didn't leave an outline. He died in 96. He didn't finish the book. The first problem is he didn't leave an outline, or an introduction chapter, or a conclusion chapter. And he would put prospective chapter title blank. You couldn't tell what order the chapters were supposed to go in. And he had many versions of each chapter. And we didn't have the electronic files, we only had printed files. So you couldn't tell the dates. So it's impossible to know, well, not impossible, difficult to know which are, the later, more final versions, which are the earlier versions. So I've been wanting to put this book out. I put it together in the way that I think he was aiming for, or at least in a way that makes sense to me. But we have not finished this project to publish the book. It's very interesting. I think it's by far the best stuff that he did. Much better than the stabilizing book. But not finished, incomplete. So anyway, if you go through those chapters, you'll see a lot of discussion that's very similar to that video, which isn't surprising. The video's at the same time. And he has in front of him, if you watch the video, you'll see he has in front of him a paper document, which he typically did, but then of course he doesn't follow it, which was also typical for him. He would, maybe read sections and then just start riffing off and going somewhere else completely. So I don't know what he had in front of him, but probably it was one of these working papers that were becoming part of the book. Okay, anyway, so going back to the Reagan period, there's a paper with a title similar to the book, so it's called Stabilizing an Unstable Economy, which was the book title, with a subtitle that is different. He said, the tax reduction of 1981, so this was the big tax cut for the rich, compromised the revenue system. As a result of its programmed tax cuts, the deficit remained at depression levels even as the expansion took hold. So we had a very deep recession. It was the worst one we'd had, but we started to recover. And we recovered strongly. Okay, so of course Reagan took credit for that. See, the tax cut worked. As I said before, all of our recent recoveries are slow recoveries, jobless. This one was a strong recovery. But we still had a big budget deficit. In Minsky's view, the budget should move toward balance if you have a strong recovery. You shouldn't remain with a big deficit as we were doing. Because of the deficits of 81 to 85, national debt increased by about 1,000 billion or $1 trillion. That's huge for this time period relative to GDP. So we had a huge increase in the outstanding debt. This means that the revenues needed for any given spending program and any given desired deficit is now some 100 billions greater. Okay, well, that's applying 10% interest average on the government debt. Our interest rates were very high at that time. 10% average. You have to make this 100 billion payment no matter what the performance of the economy is. Okay? Because of the outstanding debt stock. In the stabilizing book, he said, government can run a deficit without suffering a deterioration of its creditworthiness if there is a tax and spending regime in place that would yield a favorable cash flow, that is a surplus, under reasonable and attainable circumstances. So he's arguing, you don't actually have to have the surplus, but it has to be possible to generate a surplus under conditions that could happen. Okay? So you could say, well, we could achieve a budget surplus if the economy grew at a 25% rate, because you're not going to grow at a 25% rate. So it has to be at some achievable growth rate. He concluded there will either be a run from, and the problem is we don't have that. We have a budget that's going to remain in deficit even with good growth under Reagan. He concluded there will either be a run from the dollar or a substantial debt repudiation through inflation. So either the foreign holders of dollar-denominated assets are going to get worried about the inflation potential, so the dollar goes down in value, or we will have the high inflation, and that will lead to that inflation tax, reducing the outstanding value of the dollar, of the debt, because there's been inflation. Neither of these happened, of course. Inflation came down, and there was no run from the dollar. In other words, the problem is not the government will run out of money or default in nominal terms, but that there could be pressure on the exchange rate or pressure on the Fed to raise interest rates to fight incipient inflation. Pressure on the dollar could generate a run out, and higher rates would cause capital losses. So both of those are affecting the external value of the dollar. The holders suffer capital losses if rates go up, or they suffer losses in terms of what the dollars can buy if we have inflation. Coming to the later period, in '94, he wrote about the long-term consequences of the failure of laissez-faire economics. 94, this was our first jobless recovery. So this is Bush Sr., and although we appear to be recovering, we're not creating jobs. This period was called the Silent Depression by Wallace Peterson. Many people were worried that, you know, this is the new normal. Slow growth and no job creation. Now, Clinton was elected in 92. The first couple of years of Clinton were terrible, but he had inherited the economy from Bush Sr. We then started to grow rapidly, and all the talk about the silent depression, secular stagnation, all of that disappeared until a couple of years ago. It all came back again. But anyway, in 94, Minsky's worried about this. So we have a spurious prosperity largely based on an unproductive government deficit. We already talked about this. So the spending is on stuff that's not productive. An enormous expansion of the financial services industry. So this is the rise of what he calls money manager capitalism. And financing schemes that left the country with an excess supply of office structures, highly indebted firms, non-performing assets. So the economy is virtually stagnated for some 5 years. Okay? This is the secular stagnation, silent depression that people were writing about. Furthermore, government spending became even more inefficient as an instrument to create resources because the high interest rates and great expansion of the debt resulted in a huge item in the budget called interest on debt. So this is very typical. When debt ratios go up, if you have high interest rates, a huge part of government spending will just be to pay interest. The Reagan-Thatcher-Bush experience is the second failure of laissez-faire model. It showed the laissez-faire model of capitalism can't meet the performance standards of the Keynesian period. So laissez-faire economics doesn't work as well as Keynesian economics did. In another paper, 94, why are the capitalist economies now in crisis? Domestic issues. He also talks about international issues in another paper. Reagan and Thatcher tried to overthrow the big government interventionist capitalisms. Reaganomics caused destruction of the revenue system, so tax cuts. Emergence of an economy that was structurally dependent on government's deficit financing of a budget that was mainly devoted to transfers and military spending. A high consumption economy due to the increases of the inequality of income distribution and entitlements. The high inequality is fueling consumption by the rich, and consumption by low income is deficit finance. They're going into debt. The fall in the real wage of a large portion of the labor force. Real wages, on average in the US, fell from 1974 essentially up to the present time. They've been falling. A fragile financial system and a rising tide of un- and underemployment. Legacy of Reagan, growing international indebtedness, losing fiscal independence. Reagan era saw a vast increase in outstanding government debt, as well as a fundamental shift in the international indebtedness position of the U.S. So the U.S. goes from world's largest creditor to world's largest debtor. As a result, U.S. enters the 90s with its fiscal independence greatly reduced. Okay, what does he mean by that? In this situation, monetary and fiscal interventions to sustain U.S. profit flows in a recession or after a financial crisis may not be effective unless trading partners adjust their international posture. Okay, what does he mean? So we have a large outstanding debt held by foreigners, and we have a current account deficit. If we have a recession and the government increases its spending, the problem is that the benefits largely leak out of the U.S. in the form of the trade deficit and in the service of external holdings and claims on the U.S., both government and private sector. So the international indebtedness means profit flows and interest flows are going abroad, and the current account deficit means that the spending flows are going abroad. So in both cases, you're reducing the ability of fiscal policy to help bring up aggregate demand at home. A change in the financial economic structure over the 80s has been the change in the financial position from major creditor to major debtor. A crisis in which the U.S. will be forced to face up to its changed position is likely unless fiscal wisdom prevails. So there is going to be a crisis in forced on the U.S. The crisis could be that foreigners run out of the dollar. That will cause the U.S. to change its ways. Again, that didn't happen. Both of his very pessimistic predictions didn't happen. Reaganomics did not lead to inflation. It didn't lead to a run out of the dollar. The dollar was brought down after 85. No, sorry, the dollar was brought up after 85. It rose until 85. And then there was an agreement to reduce upward pressure on the dollar. And it didn't happen after this. Okay. Why didn't it happen after this? Asian tigers, I think. That played a big role in changing the position of the dollar around the world. Asian tigers taught the world that you can't have too many dollars. And so the idea that we're going to have a run out of the dollar, I think, disappears after that. Continuing, it sounds like he's talking about returning to a balanced budget. Ponzi financing by the government needs to come to a halt. What is Ponzi finance? Minsky had developed this term to apply it to firms mostly, but it could be households too. A Ponzi unit is one whose income flow isn't enough even to make the interest payments. So you not only can't pay the principal, you can't make the interest payments. You have to borrow to make the interest payments. So he's saying the US government is becoming a Ponzi unit. It has to borrow to make the interest payments, or nearing that position. Even though the government, unlike private institutions, may not exhaust its balance sheet equity. What does that mean? You can't force the federal government into bankruptcy. It cannot become insolvent. Ponzi financing by government means that an inflation tax will in time contain the real size of the government debt. So with inflation, the debt ratio goes down in nominal terms. The threat of an inflation tax means that private long-term debt financing needs to be at rates that compensate for the expected erosion of purchasing power of the principal due in the future. So the interest rates demanded by the holders of debt will go up. This inflation premium in interest rates is in fact an amortization of the principal. So the expected inflation leads to an interest rate premium that is similar to Ponzi finance by households and firms. That's the argument. In one of the draft manuscripts for the book, he comes up with a fiscal reform package. The spending side requires a large overhaul. The Keynes phrase, socialization of investment, means that the government spending program needs to finance a significant part of resource creation. So we need the government to increase spending on resource creation. Income from work, where if necessary the work is provided by government, should replace much of today's transfer payment. Okay, so employer of last resort instead of welfare. Employer of last resort can help to be resource creating. So you create jobs that enhance productivity rather than paying welfare. Such a package of reforms where the government debt, though growing, is always in principle, i.e. when the economy is a close approximation to full employment, being validated by revenues. So the budget will move away from deficit at a high enough growth rate. That's what he means by validated. It doesn't mean that the revenues are going to pay for it. He means that the budget will move toward a balance so that it is not going to inflate away the value of debt. So, conclusion on Minsky. Did Minsky violate Lerner's principles of functional finance? And the answers are no and yes. So, no, he adopted a more nuanced version that recognizes what government spends on matters. So, he is rejecting the idea that general demand pumping is good enough. And he wants government spending to be resource creating. Second, he recognized inflation pressures that can occur if the budget is not countercyclical enough. So we have to worry about the inflation pressures of budget deficits. He took account of the changed international position of the dollar. Early post-war period, there's no competitors. In fact, everybody is pegging to the dollar. But after the abandonment of Bretton Woods and the rise of, well, we can say the recovery of Germany and Japan, he starts worrying about the rise of competitive currencies. And he incorporated his theory of financial instability, arguing that the functional finance approach that was developed by Lerner doesn't take account of financial instability. Let me add a couple footnotes here. Lerner is the one who came up with the term stability is destabilizing. Everyone thinks that's Minsky's most famous phrase. And he used it a lot. But he's not the one who came up with the term. Minsky said Lerner came up with it. And Minsky doesn't tell us, you know, in what context did Lerner come up with it. I think he probably came up with it in the context of saying, oh, Minsky, what you're saying is stability is destabilizing. Okay, I think that Lerner invented the term to characterize what Minsky was arguing. But I don't know that for sure. The reason why I think it was in that context is because Lerner himself did not accept Minsky's financial instability approach. Although they were very close, Lerner was not convinced. Some of you may have heard Davidson or heard of Davidson saying that when Minsky and Davidson would frequently get in arguments at conferences. And Davidson would say, well, you're the glass is half empty. I'm the glass is half full. I'm the optimistic guy about capitalism. You're the pessimistic guy about capitalism. Well, Lerner also was the optimistic guy about capitalism. When Minsky wrote his first book, John Maynard Keynes, which of course is not about John Maynard Keynes, it's the development of Minsky's financial instability hypothesis. Lerner reviewed it, and it's a very nasty review. It's a nasty review of Minsky and also post-Keynesians generally. And it's clear he does not accept the financial instability hypothesis. Lerner is much more optimistic about the wonders of the free market than Minsky is. That really hurt Minsky. Lerner was a close friend, and he looked up to Lerner. Minsky wrote back a letter. You can see the review at the Minsky archives. I don't think Minsky's letter back to Lerner is there, but I've read it. And Minsky was really hurt. He said that, first, your review has almost nothing to do with my book, which was true. He wasn't really reviewing the book. He had a bone to pick with Minsky, and that's what it was all about, and with other post-Keynesians. But it's clear, Lerner was not a financial instability kind of person. It's not in his theories. So anyway, Minsky was incorporating this belief that the functional finance would lead to financial instability. If you just adopted the steering wheel metaphor and all you're doing is paying attention to aggregate demand, you're going to generate financial instability. Okay, so in those senses I would say he was just providing a functional finance approach that took account of institutional realities. Minsky, other than that 1960 paper, really did not accept pump priming in his writing or in his teaching. He always said, he went to Harvard, he got his institutional economics from Chicago, but in the end he did his dissertation at Harvard. At Harvard he was Hanson's TA, and Hanson was the Keynesian most responsible for propagating mainstream Keynesianism in the United States. Minsky said that he didn't want to work with Hanson. He didn't choose Hanson for his dissertation advisor because Hanson's approach to Keynes was too mechanical, which is what the original version of functional finance is also for Minsky. It's too mechanical. You just pump up aggregate demand. You don't worry about where you're pumping up demand. It doesn't make any difference. So it's a very mechanical approach that Minsky would not accept. Anyway, yes, he did violate the principles of functional finance, and so did Lerner. So I'm going to show the experience of the 60s influenced Minsky, and he abandoned functional finance. But the experience of the 60s influenced Lerner too, and he also abandoned functional finance. So let me show you that. In 1977, he wrote a paper on the topic of stagflation and the impact of that on Keynesianism. And I think someone said that Lerner is the one who originated this term. I'm not positive that's true. I have heard that. Stagflation, simultaneous inflation and depression from which we are now suffering, is seen by many as a paradox. Well, according to the dominant Keynesian view, it is a paradox. You should not have high inflation and high unemployment at the same time if you believe in the Phillips curve. Phillips curve says you choose one or the other. You don't have both. So it's seen as a paradox that demonstrates the bankruptcy of economic science. I see it rather as a confirmation of the deeper economic understanding developed in the last half century. Okay. So actually, this is what we should have expected as our theory developed. This development has been from a pre-Keynesian over-concentration on micro. Here he's talking about the pre-Keynesian neoclassical economics. The economics Keynes was reacting against was a microeconomics, which deals with automatic market mechanism. Through a Keynesian over-concentration on macro, which deals with government policy. So the problem with the Keynesian economics is it was too macro. Okay, and pump priming is a prime example of being too macro. You don't care about the micro. You just say pump up demand. Okay, that's an over-concentration. To a post-Keynesian, this is not post-Keynesians. This is after Keynesian. Okay, that's all it means. A post-Keynesian integration of macro with micro to deal with combination of depression and inflation. Well, at the time, this was a huge agenda for economists. It was the micro foundations of macroeconomics. And it is what eventually leads, from Lucas all the way through the development of modern macro. Get the micro foundations right. That's the problem with Keynesian economics. Although Lerner's path is not that one. So he's not going from new classical, through real business cycle theory to DSGE. His formulation is different. He says in this paper there were 3 responses to stagflation. The classicals, he doesn't mean classical economists, he means neoclassical. So he's using the term the same way Keynes used it, wrongly. This is not Marx, okay? This is the post-Marx neoclassical school of thought. Classical said Keynesianism is wrong and must be dumped. So that's the first reaction, okay, and that's the course the policy took. Reagan and Thatcher say Keynesianism is wrong, we're throwing that away. We're going back to neoclassical. Keynesians saw it as an unexplainable paradox. Okay, that's because of the Phillips curve. Government saw it as resulting from excess demand and so wanted to reduce government spending. So they thought stagflation was caused by too much government spending. This was exactly Reagan's response. But would reverse course whenever unemployment rose to double digits. So they would try austerity, but when unemployment got up, they would get scared, and so reverse course and reduce the austerity to try to fight the unemployment. And that leads to more stagflation. Okay, he confesses, I was one of those Keynesians. So in the beginning, he saw it as a paradox too. I thought some macro regulation of wages through an incomes policy could work. So you would continue to use Keynesian policy, but you would use wage and price controls to try to limit the inflation. In the US, we used wage and price controls. So Nixon imposed wage and price controls, but he says it was unimaginatively applied, flawed, failed, and abandoned. Okay, so policymakers did try it, didn't work, they abandoned. Well, that's a great simplification. In the case of the US, wage and price controls worked pretty well until they were dropped, and then the inflation resumed. It could not work because it neglected micro or market forces. Okay, so they weren't solving the micro problems. They were leading to inflation. So he said, so now he's looking at, what was the Keynesian revolution all about, and what was wrong with it. So Keynes turned the discussion from relying on the micro level adjustments, so that's the free market invisible hand argument, to using policy to engineer a macro adjustment, so pump priming. This is also what I did with my own formulation of Keynes' revolution as functional finance. So functional finance was a formulation of the Keynesian revolution. 3 pairs of policy tools: borrowing and lending, buying and selling, taxing and subsidizing. So those are the fiscal and monetary policies. What was wrong with the classical theory of prices was the assumption of a symmetry. Excess demand causes prices to rise, excess supply causes prices to fall. But that is only true if wages and prices have been stable. If prices have been rising at 10%, then excess supply reduces the rate of increase, but it doesn't cause them to fall. So we can, if excess supply occurs, it will depress inflation, but it doesn't lead to deflation. So there's not a symmetry. Too much demand causes inflation. Too much supply reduces inflation, but doesn't eliminate it. Wages are not set by markets, but by administrators, the wage negotiators representing workers and employers. They can resist when the market is telling them wages should go down. So they resist the market forces that otherwise would lead to falling wages and then prices. Policymakers thus learned how to defy the market to prevent wages from falling in a downturn, and turn that into a policy to increase wages in a downturn. So when there's a downturn, the government pumps up demand to allow wages to continue to rise. Thus was stagflation born. So what's the solution? Keynes completes the classical theory by showing that falling wages reduces prices rather than increasing employment. Okay, so this is the argument, a possible outcome in chapter 2 of the general theory. Hence, the only path to full employment is to wait for micro wages and price to fall sufficiently for the real money supply to rise enough to raise macro demand to a full employment level. So this was the Patinkin resolution. You add the Pigou effect and the Keynes effect to the ISLM model, and if wages and prices fall far enough, you eventually will get back to full employment. But Keynes prefers to provide the same increase in the real value of the money stock by increasing the number of dollars. Remember, Keynes says, why not just increase the money supply? It has all the benefits of falling wages and prices without the costs of imposing deflation on the economy. The choice was adjusting the prices to the money and the money to the prices, and so Keynes just adjusts money to the prices. The fundamental Keynesian revolution was essentially a policy revolution. It consisted of choosing the second method and calling on government to provide the additional money. Now, this is a very different view of what Keynes was all about. Okay, so it's close to the mainstream Keynesian view. Very different from the post-Keynesian view. Very different from Minsky's view. The Keynesian revolution for Minsky, for Kriegel, for Davidson, for all the fundamental Keynesians, fundamentalist Keynesians, Keynes is a theoretical revolution, not a policy revolution. Lerner is interpreting Keynes as really nothing but a policy revolution. The Keynesian revolution thus pushed discussion from micro to macro and policy from waiting for automatic market cures for depression to exercising government policy to regulate the overall quantity of money. Okay, with assist from fiscal measures. So that's all the Keynesian revolution is about. Don't wait for the market to solve the problem, have the government intervene with macro policies. The footnote is interesting. The highly fashionable contrasting of Keynesianism with monetarism arises from a misuse of the term Keynesianism for the special fiscal measures prescribed by Keynes in the depths of depression, when investors are afraid to invest, when confidence collapses, and when monetary policy won't work. Okay, so what is called Keynesianism is just focusing on the special case when you have to use fiscal policy, is what he's arguing. Hence the call for fiscal measures. So again, Keynesianism is really just a policy quirkiness of policy. It's not a theoretical difference. So Lerner proposes a resolution. He embraces monetarism. He says that his functional finance had been too focused on the macro, neglected micro or market analysis, and that's what leads to stagflation. So he proposes a peace settlement between Keynesians and monetarists, and between sound finance and functional finance. Sound finance is the belief that you should try to balance your budget. So what you want to do is issue wage increase permits equal to the desired rate of wage inflation. So many of you are familiar with pollution permits. You have a market in pollution permits, firms bid on them, that gives you the right to pollute, and this is a way to reduce pollution. So Lerner is advocating the same thing for inflation. Inflation is sort of a form of pollution, so you have to buy a permit to raise your price. Okay? So it's a market-based solution to inflation, just like the pollution permits is a market-based solution to pollution. Okay. So by saying it's market-based, that's not necessarily a critique. Maybe it will work. Set the rate of money growth equal to real output. Who does that sound like? Money growth equal to the growth of real GDP. It's Milton, Uncle Milton. That's Milton Friedman. That's monetarism. Put control of aggregate demand in the hands of the Fed. Who does that sound like? Uncle Milton. Okay. Divorce government budget from the total level of aggregate demand. You don't want the budget to move countercyclically. Divorce the budget from the movement of aggregate demand. Focus fiscal policy on social efficiency, internalizing externalities, and alleviating poverty. Pretty mainstream. I don't think Friedman would disagree with any of that. That's a pretty mainstream point of view. Even Milton Friedman agreed we should reduce poverty. Okay? So this is perfectly consistent with monetarism. Any increase of government spending should be offset by an increase of taxes. Balanced budget. It's a complete rejection of functional finance. Complete. You're going to balance the budget at all times to avoid interfering with the Fed's task of regulating aggregate demand. You don't want the government to interfere with the central bank. The central bank determines what aggregate demand will be. You can't go further than that in rejecting Lerner's functional finance, and this is Abba Lerner himself. All right, so why did they do this? Minsky shared Lerner's money as a creature of the state view. Lerner did not reject that. Even in this paper where he adopts monetarism, he still accepts that money is a creature of the state. He just doesn't want the state to use that in its fiscal policy. I mean, to take advantage of that in its fiscal policy formulation, because the state will cause inflation. All right? And he shared the functional finance approach. The first concerns fiscal capacity, the second provides a policy recommendation. So money as a creature of the state is really a description of the way things work. Functional finance was the policy consistent with that view. Post-war Keynesians like Minsky and Lerner recognize sovereign government faces no solvency constraint on its own currency. Neither of them really rejected that either. Even when they reject functional finance, they don't reject that. Fiscal policy especially should be directed to full employment. But Minsky quickly moved to directed spending. So I showed you by 68, and actually before that, 65 he was advocating ELR. Lerner later abandoned the steering wheel approach to demand management through fiscal policy. That occurred with the onset of stubborn stagflation. So Minsky abandoned the simple version of functional finance more than a decade before Lerner. Lerner's rejection was more thorough than Minsky's. He embraced a monetarist alternative, and it's actually really similar to the positive money approach, if you're familiar with that. It's taking over Britain. It's a very strong movement in Britain right now. Essentially what I just described. You have the central bank determining aggregate demand. Central bank controls the amount of government money that is created. It's not created in fiscal policy anymore, it's created by the central bank directly. Minsky's version was always more nuanced. He rejected mechanical Keynesianism in favor of an institutionalist approach. Okay, so that's my conclusion. Why did Minsky abandon it? He abandoned it much earlier when he realized that it was too macro, that general pump priming was going to cause problems. Lerner abandoned it later after we had stagflation, and I would say because his macroeconomic theory was a much simpler version of Keynes, he essentially abandoned Keynesian economics in favor of monetarism when he let go of functional finance. What Minsky did was to bring in more of his institutionalist background in his reformulation of Keynesian theory and policy. So conclusion, modern money, fiscal policy. I've already gone through this several times. I don't think that what Minsky is advocating is inconsistent in any way with MMT, in spite of what some of the people in the blogosphere were claiming. That we just need to read Minsky more carefully and see that he didn't abandon the earlier views on the solvency constraints of government. He just advocated policy that takes account of the institutional realities of the economy that we actually live in. And we don't formulate macroeconomics from, let's say, too high of a viewpoint that is ignoring the institutional relationships in the economy. So I'll stop. Take questions on, oh, is it time for a break?
Maybe it's maybe 25 and almost 3:30, so maybe we should have a short break now. An additional 10 minutes,
okay.
A bit more than that. And then we come back for
okay.
Questions.
And the questions can be on this and then anything else that we covered so far. Yes, we can take questions. Go ahead.
I have two.
Okay.
I would like you to talk a little bit more about the Hennessey's experience. Just a little bit more of the details, because I think that you have like some very interesting results.
Yeah.
And the other question is about Steve King's critique on MMT, especially Steve King. Steve King.
No, I don't know what it is.
But like, especially he critiques the trade balance approach of MMT, especially when he says exports are a cost and imports are a benefit, and he critiques this part. And he says MMT is US centered. So what do you think?
Well, the last has to be impossible. It has to be. Because one of the main developers of MMT is Australian, Bill Mitchell. And I think that Steve knows that. So that's completely disingenuous. Bill Mitchell has played as big a role as any American, and he developed it in the Australian context. So that's just absolutely wrong. I don't know what else to say about Steve. I mean, I can remember back in the day when he argued for single entry balance sheets at a conference in Kansas City. You have to do at least double entry. And finally, years later, he admitted that we were right, actually, you should use double entry. You know, now we're trying to encourage him to move to the next step, which is actually you have to do quadruple entry. Yeah. You can't do money without quadruple entry. He's not there yet. When he gets to there, you know, maybe I'll take him a little more seriously than I do. I just don't, I can't see any serious critiques coming from Steve King. Don't see it. Don't think they're there. I don't think he quite understands finance yet, but he's getting closer. He has improved tremendously. Double entry is much better than single entry. Okay. Stock flow consistency, he was not there at all. He's getting a little closer to that. So I don't know what his critique would be. The trade thing, again, Bill Mitchell writes about this all the time. Australia is a very small, very open economy with big current account deficits and with wide swings of the exchange rate. So Bill has dealt with all of that in the context of that country. You can choose to adopt current account balance constraints if you want to. Okay, and many countries do that, especially Latin American countries. They have decided that they want to constrain their economies in an effort to achieve the kind of current account balances that they want. You can do that, but you give up a lot. And so, you know, my question always is, I have taught a lot in Mexico City, and when I hear that, I say, yeah, how's that working out for you? Not very well. Okay, you're still a developing country. Mexico should be. I mean, it is very rich in resources, very rich in resources, and it continues to not use that. I think I can say the same thing about Brazil. And as I was telling one of the students, when I was in high school, we were taught Brazil is the next country that was going to challenge the United States. Rich in resources, fairly big population, not quite as big as the US. Size of the country about the same size, forget Alaska. Never happened. It's just not working out very well for you. Forget the balance of payment constraint. Just forget it, ignore it. Okay, don't adopt one. Go ahead and grow. Okay, and then you could become one of the developed rich nations, I think. Now, I'm not saying that that's easy, I mean, especially politically. Okay? And in Mexico, which I know much better than Brazil, there is a huge problem with inequality and highly unequal economies have a very hard time developing because there are the politics don't favor growth that benefits everybody. The politics don't favor that. And a large part of the balance of payment constraint is about keeping the currency strong because a lot of the sort of orientation of the elite is toward the United States. They're going to send their kids to college in the United States. They need the peso to be strong. They're going to take their vacations in Florida. They need the peso to be strong. And so if you have that orientation, if the value of the peso is far more important than achieving full employment, then you're going to be focusing on balance of payment constraint rather than trying to achieve full employment and shared prosperity for everybody. The elites not only don't mind having a lot of poor people, there are certain advantages of having a lot of poor people. Household workers are much cheaper if there's a lot of poverty. So providing a good paying job alternative is not going to be a popular thing among an elite that's used to getting cooks and maids and so on at very low wages. They don't like the competition for that. So I'm not saying the transition is easy. It's very difficult, very difficult. But at least as economists, you can look at alternative strategies. You can recommend them. It doesn't mean they're going to be adopted. But you can at least consider the alternatives to the balance of payments constraints rather than always defending them, which is what Latin American economists do all the time. Every time we talk about the fiscal capacity of a sovereign currency issue, of the possibility of achieving full employment and price stability, the number one objection that comes from post-Keynesians who are south of the border is balance of payments constraint growth. It's the number one objection. Why didn't you try to think of something different? Okay. At the JPKE, I would say over 50% of the papers submitted for us to consider for publication are balance of payments constraint growth. I mean, there's got to be another issue. There must be something else important in Brazil. There's got to be. Okay. I would say consider something else. I mean, it's not something that I can do. It's not my area of expertise at all. But other people should be working on this instead of always defending it. Defending the idea that, well, everything is hopeless because balance of payments constrained. Okay. I mean, it would be as if you're always defending a balanced budget. I mean, yeah, okay, there could be some advantages to balanced budgets, but there's lots of disadvantages of trying to achieve a continuous balanced budget. You're giving up a lot in order to pursue that one thing. On the HEVIS program, I mean, I'm not an expert, so I can tell you about my experience. Also, it was 2003, that period, which is a long time ago. So my memory can be a bit faulty. There was a guy from the labor ministry named Daniel Kotzer, who came to UMKC. He wanted to learn about what we were doing, about the job guarantee. He actually taught a course at UMKC. He took the idea of a job guarantee back to Argentina, to the labor ministry, when they were going through their crisis, and they went through 5 governments or something like that in 1 month. And sort of as a last resort, it was a last resort, they adopted an employer of last resort. They couldn't think of anything else to do to stop the protests. And so they implemented the HEFI's program, and within a matter of 4 months, within 4 months it was up and running full scale, as big as it got. And it was a limited job guarantee. It was the guarantee of 1 job per poor household with children. So it's a limited, targeted job guarantee. So it's not like the one that I've been advocating, universal. You had to be a poor household, you had to have children, and then you only got 1 job per family. Okay? The job was only half-time, so that's also a limitation we don't have. It was 4 hours of work. So you are guaranteed that if you qualify, poor household with children. The pay was very low in the program, lower than what we wanted, but it was what they thought that they could do, what they could politically get through. It grew to, now remember this is 15 years ago, I think it was 17% of the labor force, some number like that. I think it was 4 million people. So it was a very big program. It was a little bigger than the program I've been talking about for the United States, 15 million for us, but that's a much smaller fraction of the labor force. So relatively to the labor force, it was very big. The government, being composed of mostly men, had thought that the program would be a male program. So they thought each household would send the man into the program. The families were a lot smarter than that. For the most part, in the beginning, it was about 2/3 female. They sent the woman into the program. And then the man, worked in the under the table in the informal labor market, and continually tried to get a job. The reason why it was 4 hours was they wanted people to search. So you get a half-time job and you search the rest. But what really happened was the males were out searching and the females were working half-time in the program for the most part. So it was 2/3 female the first time we went, and the last time we went it was about 75% female. Males were getting hired out of the program. For the most part, females were not. So it became increasingly female over time. UMKC, I think, had about 5 visits. I went on 3. One of the visits was to try to convince them to raise the wage, to increase the minimum wage, which they didn't do. We thought it was because they were worried about the total spending on the program. That really wasn't the issue. They weren't really that worried about the budget. We thought, oh, they're conventional, they think they got to balance the budget, so they weren't really very worried about that. They just didn't want to compete with the private sector wage. They didn't want to push up the private sector wage. So they were keeping the wage low. We tried to get them to increase to 8 hours a day. They didn't do that. On most of the trips, we met with the government people. So, from the government side. On one trip, Lena and I went down. just to interview the participants in the program. And that's where we learned a lot more about what was going on. About 10% of the projects were organized by activists. The government was very smart. So by the time the program got implemented, it was Kirchner. And they were very smart in doing this because it quelled the unrest quickly. So the government says, okay, you don't like the way we're doing things, you organize the programs. And they did. So 10% were organized by activists. Those were by far the best projects we saw. Because the activists, wanted to give them good jobs, but they also wanted to benefit the community. So those projects were always oriented toward improving life in the communities that were very, very poor. So it would be things like they would build a building, and this is mostly done by the community itself. A real quick brick building. The government paid the wage for the people in the program plus 25%, just like we're proposing. That 25% could go to buy an oven. The mostly women in that project learned how to bake bread. And then mostly they distributed it free to the community. So there's a direct benefit to the community. They get free bread. Some projects, they would give away some stuff, and then some stuff they would market. It wasn't always relatively low-skilled work. Baking bread, it does take skills. They had to learn how to do it. When we interviewed people, as I said before, the number one response why they liked the program was they get to contribute to the community. But another very common answer was, I gained a skill. So the women told us they had never cooked before. Now, this was surprising to us because, we come from America, and even poor people have ovens and cook. They had no ovens. They had no stoves in their own houses. They had never cooked a meal before. And so women would tell us, for the first time, my children get to see me cooking. Okay, they had never seen that before. They had always lived on handout food. All right, so they gained skills on the job. Other projects took workers that were already skilled. Argentina had a lot of clothing manufacturing. Mostly, I think they were Korean firms employing low-wage labor in Argentina. And in the crisis, they all left, and they closed down the factories. There's a very good documentary called The Take, I think it is, or The Taking, by, I can't think of her name, a documentary filmmaker. It's fantastic. The workers organize and take back a factory, open it up, and they run it. That isn't what we saw. What we saw was very small-scale co-ops, where women who had all lost their jobs at one of these clothing factories got some space in their village and used the funding that the government provided, in addition to wages, to buy several sewing machines. And they would make clothes, including school uniforms. So they would donate school uniforms, and then they also produced clothing that was sold either to the government or to private purchasers at markets. They ran this very small clothing factory as a Jefes project for 4 hours. And then they ran it as a workers' co-op for the next 8 to 12 hours, where all of the revenue from the co-op part was shared among all the workers, okay, all the net revenue. So they got 4 hours of Jefes pay, plus all the shared profits from the extra hours that they worked. So that was permitted, and from that we got the idea that workers' co-ops is a very good project. You can start off, workers get together, they propose a project that's a workers' co-op. The government program pays their wages for the first couple of years, and then if they're successful, they can go as a private cooperative. We saw what else? Another example of skills was woodworking. There was a factory that made furniture, and that stuff was so good it was sold in shopping malls. It competed perfectly well with for-profit furniture manufacturers. So these were high-skilled workers who had lost their jobs in the crisis, and they started a Hefes-run project producing furniture that you could buy in shopping malls. So that's sort of the upper extreme of the skilled work you saw in these kinds of projects. 90% of the projects were government, hospital, educational institutions that created jobs. And we didn't really visit any of those. We were focused on the activists. Okay, so all this sounds great. I mean, what we observed really was incredible. Incredibly beneficial to the communities and to the workers in the program. Now, as the economy recovered, the males were pulled out of the program. It became increasingly female. So on our last trip down, we went back to talking to the government officials, the labor ministry and the finance ministry, and they told us that the government was thinking of reforming the program. And what they were going to do was to replace Hefes with unemployment compensation for the economically active population. And they would provide unemployment compensation for up to 2 years to the economically active. Well, that was a code word for the males. So they were going to offer unemployment compensation to the males, they wouldn't have to go to the Hefes program, and they would earn more unemployment compensation than they would earn in the Hefes program. So basically, you're ending male participation in the program. For the economically inactive population, which meant females, it was very clear, what they were doing. They were going to give them welfare. The welfare, if you had 2 children or more, would be more than your earnings in the Hefes program. So the idea is that the women would voluntarily leave the program to get welfare. We came back to the U.S., we argued with them, we said, but the women that we interviewed in the program want to work, they don't want welfare. That actually was one of the questions on our questionnaire. Everyone said they'd rather work. There wasn't a single person who said they'd rather have welfare. Not one. Said, if the pay is the same, would you rather have welfare? They all said no. They said they wanted to work. Okay, anyway, so we told the government officials to say, yeah, but they're so inefficient. I said, what do you mean by that? He said, well, look, so the example that you gave us of the bakery. He said, we have modern factories that produce bread much more efficiently than those women can do it. So thinking of, Wonder Bread and Hostess and international companies that can produce bread with a labor efficiency that's much higher because there's a lot of machinery involved. He said, well, that could be true, but they're baking bread and giving it away to the community. They said, well, we can buy the bread from Wonder Bread and give it away to the community, and it'll be more efficient. He said, well, but then the women don't get the opportunity to work and get all the benefits of working. And they said, yeah, but they're too inefficient. So they didn't place any value at all on what the women wanted to do. And, the notion that working you get to contribute to society, they didn't care. We went back to the U.S. and a month later, the government implemented the reform. So a year later, one of my students went back down and interviewed some of the same women we had interviewed. They were still there working for free. They were collecting welfare, still showing up, baking the bread, because they got all the benefits from working. So they found a solution to the problem. They just continued to work. Now, I don't know what happened after that. That was maybe 2005, 2006. I have no idea. I don't think the HEFIS program was officially ever ended. They just figured through attrition it would disappear, which is what they wanted. So it's sort of sad. We learned a lot that was beneficial, but the ending is very sad. So in addition to the good idea of having activists do it, that's why we shifted to decentralized program. Have the communities propose the projects. The other thing that was very good was the way that they administered and evaluated programs. It was at various levels, from community level all the way up to the national level. So that's in our proposals. Also, to reduce corruption, the payment was made directly to the worker. So the project organizers never got those wages because there could be an incentive of theft or creating fictitious workers and so on. The workers had to get a Social Security number, which was a good thing, and a bank account. So that it was paid directly to their bank accounts. So that would reduce that kind of corruption. You can still have corruption, but it reduces that kind. And then the final thing was everything was online. The project proposals, the program participants, that is the employees, their names, the evaluations, everything was online. So that the communities and neighbors could help discipline the program. So you say, oh, we know that person died, right? And they're still getting paid. There was a way to have external checks of the program. Anyone could go online to see what the proposal was, to see what the evaluations of the proposal was. That also seems like a very good thing as a way to reduce corruption. In some countries like the US, some of that would be very difficult to do. The idea of having everyone's name online, we probably couldn't do that in the US because of privacy. So anyway, I don't know. Is there any specific questions?
You talk about the payment system, but I was curious about
I would like to learn more about NEMT and income distribution.
Okay.
Because here in Brazil we have a very great problem in relation to that one. And maybe for us it's a little hard to imagine that only a program with jobs for all could solve our problem. And we know that wages are very, very important, and we saw that in the last 12 years, for example, with the improvements in the minimum wage in Brazil. But we still have a very great problem in income distribution.
Yeah.
One of the worst in the world.
Okay, so when Minsky's writing, of course he's talking about the US. So we have income inequality and we have wage inequality, but it's not on the same scale. But his proposal is that, so we start with the employer of last resort wage. If you want it to be the least disruptive possible when you implement, you use the existing minimum wage. Okay, so for the U.S. that would be $7.50 an hour. Now we don't want to do that, but if you didn't want to disrupt private business, set it at the minimum wage, because if they're legal, they're already paying it, right? They don't have to raise their wage. You give very few benefits if you want to be the least disruptive. So you wouldn't give health care, you wouldn't give vacation at times. So again, we don't want to do that. We want to disrupt the private sector. Force them to give decent benefits too. So that's one issue. So exactly where you set it in the beginning, you have to decide. Do you want to disrupt the private sector or not? But given that, what you do over time is you have that wage increase faster than the rate of growth of labor productivity. So what that is doing is it's shifting a bigger share towards the bottom, because their wage rises faster than average labor productivity. They're getting a bigger and bigger share of output. Then what he proposed is at the top, you do the opposite. You pressure the wage hikes at the top. You prevent them from rising as fast as labor productivity. I think it's his 74 paper on ELR where he goes through the sort of a calculation of this, of what would happen. And so you're shifting the share of distribution away from the highest paid and toward the lower paid. Because the highest paid, their wage increase is lower than wage productivity, so they will get an increasingly smaller share of output. How do you do that? Well, the highest wages are in the most advanced sectors, and generally those are the sectors that the government makes a lot of purchases from. Those are oligopolized sectors, and in the past they were unionized sectors. So the government has to negotiate with them. They're already negotiating with them. The government is already planning with them, because the sort of stuff that the government is buying is for the military, it's for NASA, and it's all on contract, it's all with guaranteed profits, it's all cost plus markup. So the government can use its pricing power to say that we're going to keep the rate of growth of the prices of this stuff that we're buying below the rate of inflation. And you need to keep your wages growing slower than the increase of average wages and labor productivity. So the government uses pricing power to do that. That's how Minsky thought you could compress the distribution of wages. Now that's only wages, right? And in the US that is now less than 50% of income. I assume in Brazil it's less than 50% of national income. You have to tackle the non-wage income too. Minsky doesn't write as much about this in specific terms, but in general, this is moving away from the strategy I was talking about yesterday, I think it was, with trying to use investment as the tool to have to manage aggregate demand. That is a strategy that boosts profits. So you're stimulating investment in order to get economic growth. Minsky's switching to using wages at the bottom to get economic growth. So rather than giving tax cuts to business or incentives to invest, that is, you get to write off investment in your taxes, which promotes investment, that creates profits. So Minsky would depress profit income by switching away from that investment-led growth to wages-led growth. So that will help to tackle that. that's sort of the gross profit income. There are different segments of profit income. There's also rent, and there's interest. So you also want to try to depress those. The interest income you can depress by reversing the movement toward financialization of the economy, or what Minsky called money manager capitalism, which I talk about either the next lecture or the one after that. So this has become a huge problem. The financial sector now gets 40% of all profits in the US. So what we have to do is downsize finance. So I agree with you. Just looking at wage inequality doesn't solve these other issues. We have to do something about the financial sector. In some economies, you have to do something about rent from property, in the US too, where those are a huge share of gross profit income. So you have to do something about rent. One thing you can do is build public housing. So you can drive down rents by increasing the supply, which the US used to do, but basically we don't have any public housing construction anymore at all. So we need to build public housing to reduce rental income. So attack financialization, attack high rents, that will help to reduce inequality. In the US, the great increase of inequality, I would say this isn't based on any close research. I would say two factors: financialization and no growth of wages at the bottom. So those are the two things that will work in the US. Attack those two things and you could greatly reduce inequality. Go after Wall Street and raise wages at the bottom, and you would do a lot. Yeah.
Let me come back to Julia's first question. I pretty much agree that we, Brazilian and perhaps Latin American post-Keynesian economists in general, that we tend to exaggerate sometimes a little bit uncertainty and instability and fragility as obstacles to the adoption of Keynesian policies. And by instability, I mean the instability of conventions and political and financial and external fragility. We're always arguing as if we were on the verge of a huge crisis. Nevertheless, they do happen. Mm-hmm. And the consequences of a currency attack, uncontrolled or uncontrollable currency depreciation, of an external debt, we've lived that. We know how painful the consequences are in terms of loss of product, in terms of income distribution, in terms of inflation as well. So, don't you think it might be on the exact? You might be on the exact opposite of that. You might be underestimating a little bit the consequences of such events. What do you say to economists, Latin American economists, when they do voice this kind of concern? Because they are not. I don't think they are Latin American, progressive, left-wing, post-Keynesian economists are actually worried about the costs of educating their kids in the U.S. They are concerned with this. They are building on this experience we have had.
Yeah. Well, so at least in important cases, mm-hmm. the currency crises come when you try to peg your currency. So you certainly should not do that. Trying to peg your currency just opens up the opportunity for someone like George Soros to say, I can take that down.
Mhm.
So the first thing would be don't peg your currency. The second, and I mean, I think we should be able to get agreement on that. That is going to be a mistake for most countries. There are exceptions. If you have huge, unassailable foreign currency reserves, go ahead and peg. Okay, no problem. You're Singapore, you're Taiwan, you're China, go ahead and peg.
Mhm.
Almost nobody else should ever consider it, because you will be defeated. The second thing is that, and I think we can agree, you need capital controls. The idea that capital should be free to move anywhere that it wants, as quickly as it wants to do, without having disastrous consequences for countries, I think is crazy. It can have a disastrous consequence. So float your currency, but don't open up your capital markets. Okay, go ahead and impose controls. I don't know exactly what kinds of controls. At least make it costly to get out, so that well, costly, but especially time. Have a time component. Make it difficult to get out quickly would be, I think, part of the answer to reducing the risks of that. So don't peg, that reduces risks greatly of a currency crisis. And then also put in constraints to reduce the risks of a currency crisis. So those are sort of, you know, short-term problems that can be created, but with very bad consequences. What you want to do to increase the demand for your currency, which can increase your capacity to import without negatively impacting it. You know, it's why the U.S. can run current account deficits forever, because there's a huge demand for dollars around the world, is to develop your economy and to develop the international trust in your institutions, in the belief in that you've got stable governance, that you've got court systems that enforce contracts, that your government's not going to suddenly reverse its protections of the investors' interests. All of those things help to create demand for, external demand for financial assets denominated in your currency that increases your ability to import. Then you also need to, so that's sort of developing institutions. You also need to develop your economy so that you can satisfy internal demand without having to rely on imports, and so that possibly you can export, because the Steve Keen, you know, the only rational reason to export is to be able to import. Otherwise, it's not rational. It's not a rational decision. You know, if you're stepping back and taking a big view of what economies are all about. So your exports are the cost of your imports. All right. So you want to be able to export something so you can import something. You shouldn't want to export so you can get dollars. That's not a rational. Economically. Now, because of the way the global economy is played right now, that is the strategy of a huge number of countries around the world, including in particular Asian countries. Okay, And they're doing it because of lessons they learned from the Asian tiger crisis. That if you want to be able to manage your currency, you got to have a lot of dollar reserves. And so the winners, if that is your goal, are the ones who are exporting nations. Within Euro land, the way the euro was set up, the only way to win in Euroland is to be the exporting country. So that's why Germany is the exporter. In Euroland, if you're not an exporter, you will lose. Okay? And that's exactly what we found out. So because of the way this game has been constructed, in a very irrational way, exporting has become a goal, but it shouldn't be a goal. Exporting is the cost of imports. Export is a cost, imports are a benefit. Okay? And this is what Steve Keen apparently disagrees with. How can you disagree with that? Exporting is a cost. Your workers are producing stuff you don't get to enjoy. That's what we call a cost. Imports are a benefit. You get to enjoy the stuff that other economies produced. Okay? That's a benefit. Exporting nations are maximizing their cost and minimizing their benefit. What do we call that? Irrational. It is irrational. Okay? The United States is doing the opposite. We're rational. Okay. Now, of course, we don't operate our whole economy rationally at all because we have unemployment. That is irrational. You have people who want to work and you tell them, no, you can't have a job. That's irrational. Anyone who wants to work should be working. Okay? Any rational economy will always operate at full employment. So I'm not saying the U.S. is fully rational, just in the matter of imports and exports. We behave in a rational manner. You want to send us your output in exchange for credits at the Fed? Well, that's crazy, but we'll take that. Okay, that's a crazy policy strategy for you, but we'll accommodate it. We'll take your output. And in return, you get a credit at the Fed. Have fun. So Brazil, does need to import some stuff, and so you should try to export some stuff. So you want to use policy that will encourage exports, not for the sake of exporting, but for the sake of getting the benefits from the imports. I don't know. That, those would be my answers. And I think on some of that, there's probably complete agreement that we do need to export some stuff. I think they will agree with that. We need to import some stuff. And the best way to pay for imports is by export, not by going into debt. I think they agree on capital controls. And I don't know if there's still anyone who advocates fixed exchange rates for Latin American countries. That's pretty crazy. That's a recipe for crisis. Other questions? Yeah.
Regarding sectoral balances,
Yeah.
every time I hear you describing endogenous money creation, and at the end you said that it's not a prescription, but a description of what has always been money creation in historical countries. I remember that Brazilian government is obligated by law to have a balanced budget. So it must mean that in Brazil, or for an economy constrained in such a way, the sectoral balances dynamics operate in a different way, in a faulty way, in an irrational way, meaning that there must be another deficit somewhere else. I'd like to hear you talk more about that.
Well, first, you can mandate a balanced budget all you want. That doesn't mean that you will achieve a balanced budget. we don't have, Congress has tried to pass a balanced budget amendment. They've never been able to do it. But even if they did, it doesn't mean we will have a balanced budget. They can mandate it all they want. They have mandated that anyone who proposes a new spending policy, say the job guarantee or anything else, they have to pay for it, either through a spending cut somewhere else or a tax increase. Okay, so Congress has actually mandated that on itself. And we've been operating that way for a couple of decades. Has that eliminated budget deficits? Not at all. Okay, so I say a job guarantee, and the way I'm going to pay for it is through cutting spending on medical care. Okay, and maybe I actually could, identify a few programs, I cut those out. And the problem is, by cutting those, I increase medical spendings somewhere else in the budget. And so it turns out that I didn't pay for it at all. So that's what actually happens. Our state governments, 48 of them, have constitutions that require balanced budgets. Does that mean that they run balanced budgets? No, it doesn't. Because in a recession, lots of them will end up with deficits. All it means is that when you pass your budget, your projection is that it will be balanced. Okay, it doesn't mean you'll end up with a balanced budget, because ex post, it depends on how everything turned out. Because you have spending here and you have taxing here, and the streams are different. So you can end up with a deficit even if you have a balanced budget requirement. So that's one point. But let's say you do end up with a balanced budget. So now you also have other governments in Brazil, not just the national government, just as we do in the US. But let's say all governments taken together, end up with a balanced budget, okay? Then if your private sector ends up with a surplus, which is what most private sectors do most of the time. If you look at sectoral balances for a huge variety of countries, you will see that most of the time the private sector runs a surplus, which makes sense. If you take households and firms together, firms in some years will run deficits, okay? And maybe typically they're right around balance. But households run surpluses, typically, all the time, because they're saving. Okay? Households are the savers of society, and generally that's required. If households are experiencing difficulty, they will try to save more. They will reduce their spending. And the activities of households will have a big impact on the economy. They save because they've got kids who are going to go to college, because eventually they got retirement. Aging societies will tend to save more, at least if they're wealthy. So the private sector taken as a whole will have a surplus. If the government budget is balanced, what does that mean for the external sector? It must be running a deficit, which means you have a current account surplus. Countries that have current account surpluses can end up with balanced budgets and even budget surpluses without negative consequences for the private sector. So a country like Taiwan can run continual budget surpluses, and the private sector is okay. Countries that are not large net exporters get into severe trouble if their government moves toward a balance. And the reason is because they have a deficit on their external account, Okay, so that is a big negative. And a balanced budget, that means that the private sector must be spending more than its income. When the private sector spends more than its income, you get Minskyan financial fragility. The debt becomes unbearable. And especially the household sector will cut back, which then of course impacts the firm sector. Firms will cut back, they'll lay off workers, households will cut back even more, you spiral into a recession. So the consequence of running a balanced budget depends on whether you are a big net exporter or if you have more balanced trade or even a current account deficit. In that case, moving toward a balanced budget has hugely negative consequences. You cannot survive very long. In the US, we started running a budget surplus under President Clinton. That's when Godley was at the Institute and he started warning about this. He and I wrote papers together about the end of Goldilocks, the Goldilocks economy. It went on longer than we thought. It went on for 5 years. Well, the budget surplus was 2.5 years. The private sector deficit went on for 5 years, and we went into the dot-com crash. We renewed a private sector deficit for 5 more years, and we got the global financial crisis. So that was a very unusual period with first a budget surplus and then a smaller deficit than we should have had. But it was very unusual, practically unprecedented for the US. Spain had something very similar. But these situations are very unusual because the consequences of running private sector deficits are so severe in terms of instability. So that's the consequence for the other sectors. Net exporters can balance their budgets without bad consequences. If you're not a net exporter, it's very difficult to run a balanced budget without creating big problems in the private sector. Other questions?
Can you talk a little bit about the financial implications and financialization? And based on what Rodrigo asked, we have the constraint over the primary deficits or results because the nominal or even the operational deficits is secondary. So there is like a layer of protection over the interest payment that constrains the budget until primary deficits, but not over that. So can you talk a little bit about financial implications on this?
Well, we were talking about that today with Minsky.
Yeah.
You know, paying interest is not a very efficient use of government spending. It's not going where you want the spending to go. So first, some of it could be to foreigners, right? In the case of the US, a lot of the government bonds are held externally, and so you're helping to stimulate foreign economies. That's not really in the US interest. So paying interest to foreigners is not a very efficient kind of government spending, is what Minsky was arguing. If you look at Japan, all the debt is held internally. So when the Japanese government pays interest, it actually is going into their economy. So at least it's more efficient than in the case of the US, where a lot of it's going external. The conventional wisdom is that government bonds are held by wealthier people. Well, again, that's not really where you want to target your spending. They're already wealthier, right? You want to target your spending to poor people. Well, poor people generally don't hold government bonds, so interest payment is not helping with respect to inequality. However, that could be overstated because in the case of the US, financial assets are held by elderly people, dominantly. Okay, it's elderly people that hold financial assets, not necessarily wealthy people. In that case, it may not be so bad. You're making payments to elderly people who are probably retirees, right? So interest payments to retirees, maybe that's not so objectionable. They aren't necessarily wealthy. In the US, government bonds are held mostly by financial institutions, not by individuals. So actually, most of the interest payments are going to financial institutions. Well, that makes it a lot harder to analyze who is benefiting from that. Okay, they're going to pension funds. Is that bad? Well, maybe not so bad, because these are the what will be used to pay the retirements of workers when they retire. That could be in the public interest to pay interest to pension funds. But of course, they're also held by hedge funds. Well, hedge funds are managing the money of mostly rich people. So that's not so good. So what I'm saying is it's very complicated to figure out who the interest payment is going to. All in all, it's probably not going to be biased toward lower income people. So all in all, probably it's not a good idea to pay a lot of interest. But you really have to look at where the interest payments are going on government debt to answer that question. I can't answer it for you. In the case of Brazil, I have no idea. In the case of the US, it's probably not that bad for the interest payments that go to the US. Okay, but it varies over time, but maybe 50% of the bonds are held outside the US, so about half of our interest payments are going abroad, not helping Americans. So that's not a very good use of government spending. So that, I'm only talking about government bonds here, not talking about interest in general, financialization of the economy, the share of profits that go to the financial sector itself. Now, all of those are very bad developments that I'll talk about when I talk about money manager capitalism. So just focusing on government payment of interest, probably not a good idea. Which means what you want is a very low interest rate on government bonds. That will reduce interest payments. If you have a lot of debt outstanding and high interest rates, you're spending a tremendous amount on interest. And probably a lot of that is going to the wrong places. So you want to reduce the interest rate on government bonds. That would be probably the right strategy for most countries. Reduce it down as close to zero as you can get it would be the right strategy. Any other questions?
So maybe before finishing for today, just a reminder for those that are interested, tomorrow morning, Professor Puchin will be giving us a lecture about the internalization of renminbi from an MMT perspective. So it will be tomorrow, 9:30. Is same room.
Let me add that there will be Minsky in there. Minsky didn't write a lot on international topics, but he did write 3 papers that I know of, possibly some others, on the sort of the international aspects of the dollar, and she'll present some Minsky to his views on what it takes to be an international currency. Minsky had very specific, you could say peculiar Minskyan approach to the international reserve currency. We should talk about that.